Recently, one of our subscribers left this comment, asking us to uncover the reality of the Trail of Tears. It's one of the darkest and most misunderstood chapters in American history, surrounded by myths and forgotten truths. We thought it was a brilliant idea for a deep dive, so today we are doing exactly that. A huge thank you for the suggestion. If you have a historical event or a Wild West myth you want us to debunk next, drop your ideas in the comments below. We read all of them. Now, let's get into the real story. In the winter of 1838, a group of men, women, and children were forced to leave the only land they had ever known. The ground was frozen. The wind came from the north, and the soldiers standing behind them were not there to protect them. They were there to make sure nobody turned back. Welcome to Mystery Wild West. And what you are about to hear is not the version most people were taught in school. If this is the kind of history that actually tells you something real, subscribe. We go deeper here than most. Before we go further, have you ever been forced to leave a place you called home? Not by choice, by order. Think about that. Because what these people went through was not a journey. It was a sentence. And the people who handed down that sentence never walked a single mile of it. Most people have heard the name, Trail of Tears. They know it was bad. They know people died. But here is what most people do not know. It was not a tragedy that happened by accident. It was planned. It was legal. It was signed into law by men sitting in comfortable offices hundreds of miles away, and the people who carried it out knew exactly what would happen. That is the part nobody wants to say out loud. Let us go back to the beginning. Not to 1838, earlier, because this did not start with soldiers on horseback. It started with paper. It started with arguments in rooms where no one from the affected nations was allowed to speak. In 1830, a law was passed. It had a clean, official name, the Indian Removal Act. 5 words. And those 5 words changed everything for tens of thousands of people living across the southeastern part of the continent. The Cherokee, the Choctaw, the Creek, the Chickasaw, the Seminole. 5 nations, 5 peoples, each with their own language, their own laws, their own towns, their own farms, each with a history in that land that stretched back further than anyone in Washington could trace their own family. But here is the part that gets left out of most history lessons. These were not nomadic tribes living in the wilderness. The Cherokee had a written language. They had their own newspaper. They had courts, schools, and a formal government with a constitution modeled in part on the American one. A man could ride through Cherokee territory and pass through towns that looked no different from any frontier settlement. Brick buildings, cultivated fields, fences, roads, mills. These people were not living in the past. They were building a future that looked remarkably like the one the settlers around them claimed to want. And that future was taken from them, not overnight. That is important to understand. The pressure had been building for decades. Settlers kept moving in from the east. Land was cleared, borders were pushed. Each time a boundary was drawn, it was eventually crossed. The richest men in the region wanted the land, not some of it, all of it. And in 1829, gold was discovered in Georgia, in Cherokee territory. Suddenly, every argument about coexistence disappeared. The land was valuable now, and valuable land does not stay in the hands of people who cannot fight back politically. So the law passed, and the removal began. The Choctaw were first. 1831. They walked west in waves, through Mississippi, through Arkansas, in conditions that were already severe before the worst of winter set in. One leader, speaking to a newspaper reporter, described it as a trail of tears and death. That phrase would outlast everything else. But in 1831, most people in the East did not pay attention. It was far away. It was someone else's problem. It always is. But here is what that actually looked like on the ground. A family is given a date. They are told they must leave by that date or face arrest. They have a short window to gather what they can carry. A man looks at his house, the one he built himself, the one his children were born in, and he has to decide what to take. Tools, food, blankets. He cannot take everything. He takes what he thinks will keep them alive on the road. Everything else stays behind. The house, the farm, the livestock, the fields he planted that season, all of it stays. Strangers will move in before the ground thaws. The family walks west. Some have wagons. Most do not. The government promised supplies would be waiting at checkpoints. The supplies were late or wrong or never came at all. A child gets sick 3 days into the march. There is no shelter that night. The temperature drops below freezing. The family stops by the side of the road, huddled together. By morning, the child cannot walk. The column keeps moving. You either keep up or you are left behind. This happened again and again. Not once, hundreds of times. The Creek were removed in 1836. Many were transported in chains, accused of resisting, even those who had done nothing. Men who had not raised a hand against anyone were shackled at the wrists and marched like prisoners because someone decided it was easier to move people that way. When they arrived in Indian Territory, the land west of the Mississippi that was supposed to be their permanent new home, it was nothing like what had been described to them. Dry, strange, unfamiliar. The soil was different. The plants were different. None of the animals they knew. None of the waterways they had learned to read. The skills that had kept them alive for generations, hunting, farming, reading the seasonal rhythms of a particular landscape, did not transfer, not quickly, and not without cost. Nobody had thought to ask whether they would. Now think about this for a moment. You have spent your entire life learning to read the land around you. You know which plants are safe to eat and which will kill you. You know where the water runs clean in summer and where it goes bad. You know how the weather changes in that specific valley, in that specific season. You know the soil. You know the animals. You know the trails. That knowledge, generational, deep, practical, passed from parent to child over hundreds of years, is stripped away the moment you are moved to land you have never seen. You are not just losing a home. You are losing the entire system of survival knowledge that your family has built across generations. That is a detail most people skip over. It should not be, but it gets worse. The Cherokee fought back, not with violence, through the courts. They hired lawyers. They filed cases. They argued the law, and they won. In 1832, the Supreme Court ruled in their favor. The state of Georgia could not legally extend its authority over Cherokee territory. Cherokee sovereignty was recognized under federal law. The ruling was clear. The federal government was supposed to enforce it. It did not. The president at the time simply chose not to act on it. The law said one thing. The man with the power to enforce it said no. And because no one could force him to act, that was the end of it. The Cherokee had done everything correctly. They had used the legal system the way it was designed to be used. They had made their case with evidence and precedent. They had won in the highest court in the country. And it did not matter. Think about what that means. Not in abstract terms. Think about a specific man, a Cherokee lawyer, educated fluent in English, who has spent years on this case, he receives the news that the Supreme Court has ruled in their favor. He believes, for a moment, that the system has worked, that the law means something, that the ruling will be enforced, and then slowly the reality becomes clear. The enforcement is not coming. The president has no intention of acting. The ruling will sit on paper and do nothing. What does that man do with that realization? Where does it leave him? By 1835, the situation had grown desperate. A small faction within the Cherokee Nation, a minority group, not the elected leadership, not representatives chosen by the community, signed a treaty agreeing to removal in exchange for money and land in the West. This group had no authority to speak for the Cherokee people. The majority of the Cherokee population rejected the treaty loudly and clearly. Their elected principal chief rejected it. More than 15,000 Cherokees signed a petition to Congress opposing it. 15,000 signatures. In a nation of around 17,000 people, the government accepted the minority treaty anyway and declared it legally binding on everyone. 17,000 people were now obligated under law to abandon their homes based on an agreement signed by a few dozen men who had no right to make it. And there was nothing they could do. Soldiers came in 1838 to begin enforcement, not gradually. They moved quickly to prevent organized resistance. Men were taken from their fields in the middle of a workday. Women were pulled from their homes while they were cooking, while they were nursing children. Families were separated in the chaos and confusion. People who had lived in those communities their entire lives were given no time to prepare, no time to gather their belongings in any organized way. They were marched to holding camps, stockades, wooden enclosures built to contain large numbers of people while the government organized the logistics of mass movement. The camps were overcrowded from the start. Summer turned into autumn, and people were still being held. Disease spread through the stockades the way it always does when people are packed together without adequate sanitation or food. Dysentery, measles, whooping cough. People died in the stockades before the march even began. A soldier who served during the roundup wrote about it years later. He described arriving at a house to remove a family. The grandmother of the household was on her knees in the main room praying aloud. She was still praying when they let her out. He said she did not resist. She simply prayed. He said he never forgot the sound of her voice in that empty house as they walked her to the road. He said he wished he could forget it. The record suggests he was considered one of the more humane officers involved in the campaign. The march west began in the autumn of 1838 and continued through the brutal winter that followed. The routes varied depending on which group was moving and who was managing the transport. Some groups were moved partially by boat along rivers. Most walked hundreds of miles through Tennessee, through Kentucky, across the Mississippi River, through Missouri, through Arkansas, into what is now Oklahoma. The winter of 1838 into 1839 was severe. Temperatures in some areas dropped further than anything the groups were equipped for. Blankets had been promised. Warm clothing had been promised. In many cases, the contractors hired to manage the supply chain were cutting corners, delivering less than the agreed amount, substituting cheaper goods, pocketing the difference. The people walking west were paying for those shortcuts with their health and their lives. Frostbite, dysentery, pneumonia, measles, exposure. Children died first, as they often do in conditions like these. The elderly followed. People died along the road and were buried in whatever the ground could hold. shallow graves marked with a stone, a piece of wood, a carved branch. Sometimes there was nothing to mark the spot at all. The column kept moving. Families kept walking, because stopping meant soldiers moving you along. Because there was nowhere to go back to, even if they let you turn around. A woman walks in the middle of a column on a gray December morning. She is carrying an infant and pulling a child by the hand. Her husband is somewhere behind her. She lost sight of him 2 days ago. She does not know if he is still walking or if he was one of the ones who did not wake up that morning. She keeps moving, because moving is the only option. The ground is frozen under her feet. Her shoes wore through 2 weeks ago. She has wrapped her feet in cloth. It is not enough. This is not a fictional scene. This is a description of documented conditions. It happened to real people whose names we do not know because nobody thought to write them down. How many people died? The numbers depend on the source and the method of counting. The Cherokee Nation itself estimated that around 4,000 of their people died, roughly 1 in 4 of those who were removed. Some historians place the number considerably higher when deaths in the stockades and deaths shortly after arrival are included. The death toll across all 5 nations, the Cherokee, the Choctaw, the Creek, the Chickasaw, and the Seminole, runs into the tens of thousands. These are not abstractions. Each one was a person. Each one had a name. Each one had a house, a family, a daily life that was functioning before the government decided it should not be allowed to continue. Here is something that almost never gets discussed. The land the Cherokee and other nations were moved onto in Indian Territory was not empty. It had already been partially settled by other displaced peoples who had been removed earlier. The Choctaw and the Creek had been in the region for years by the time the Cherokee arrived. The influx of tens of thousands of additional people created immediate pressure on land and resources that were already stretched. Multiple displaced nations were now compressed into a region that could not comfortably absorb all of them. The government had created a problem built directly on top of a previous problem, and it described this situation as a permanent solution. Not everyone accepted it quietly. There is another piece of the picture that rarely gets attention. The Chickasaw negotiated more carefully than the others. They insisted on specific terms, demanded more money, pushed back on the timeline, and they suffered less as a result. Their removal, while still brutal and disruptive, had lower death rates than the others. Not because the government was more humane toward them, because they had the leverage to negotiate at the right moment and the leadership to use it. The lesson is a painful one. The difference between the nations that negotiated effectively and the ones who trusted in legal rulings or moral arguments was measured in thousands of lives. The law did not protect people equally. Leverage did. And here is a detail about the land itself that very few people know. The region designated as Indian Territory, the land west of Arkansas and Missouri that was supposed to be a permanent home for the removed nations, was described in government reports as unsuitable for large-scale agriculture. The men writing those reports knew this. The soil in parts of the territory was thin. Water sources were unreliable in dry years. The growing season did not match what the southeastern nations had built their agricultural systems around. They knew. They used it anyway. A family that had farmed rich Georgia bottomland for generations arrived in Indian Territory and found ground that needed years of careful work before it would produce reliable harvests. Years they did not have, because they arrived with almost nothing in a new place, with winter coming and no infrastructure to support them while they rebuilt. The first years in Indian Territory killed people who had survived the march. That does not get said often. The Seminole in Florida resisted removal with force. What followed became one of the longest and most expensive military campaigns in American history up to that point. The Second Seminole War lasted 7 years. It cost the government tens of millions of dollars and the lives of hundreds of soldiers. A relatively small number of Seminole fighters, using the swamps and cypress forests of Florida the way they had known them their entire lives, managed to hold off a much larger and far better equipped military force for nearly a decade. They knew the land. The soldiers did not. And that knowledge was the difference. Some Seminole were never removed. Small groups moved into the deepest parts of the Everglades and simply could not be found. The government eventually gave up. Their descendants still live in Florida today. They are among the only native peoples in the Southeast who never signed a removal treaty. But that resistance was the exception. For most of the 5 nations, the removal was completed. The land was taken. The march was finished. And the people who arrived in Indian Territory began the enormous work of rebuilding lives from almost nothing. And here is the part that almost nobody tells. They did it. They built towns again. They reestablished their governments. They opened schools. The Cherokee rebuilt their newspaper in Indian Territory, printing in both Cherokee and English. Within a few years of arrival, the Choctaw established a formal educational system that produced literacy rates comparable to many eastern states. Within a generation, the 5 nations had reconstructed much of what had been systematically destroyed, not because anyone helped them, because they refused to stop. That part of the story is almost never told, because it complicates a simpler narrative. It is easier to tell a story of complete destruction than to acknowledge that the people involved were resilient, organized, and capable in ways that challenge certain assumptions. Now, here is the part that should make anyone uncomfortable. The removal was not a fringe position. It was popular, genuinely popular, among the majority of white American voters in the East and South. There were voices in Congress who opposed it. Some representatives argued against it with real conviction. Missionaries and church groups spoke out publicly. A few newspapers printed editorials criticizing the policy, but the political majority supported it. The economic argument was straightforward and widely accepted. The land was more productive in the hands of settlers. The ideological argument was also widely accepted that 2 systems of government could not share the same territory. And then there was the argument that the removal was actually good for the native peoples. That being moved west of the Mississippi, away from the encroaching settlers and the conflicts that came with them, would ultimately protect them and allow them to survive. That argument, that destroying what people had built and forcing them into the unknown was for their own benefit, was used to justify conditions that killed thousands of them. It is a type of argument with a very long history. There is a specific detail about the aftermath that is almost always skipped. When a family finally arrived in Indian Territory after months of marching, after burying people along the road, after surviving conditions that were never supposed to be as bad as they were given a plot of land, unfamiliar land, and then, in many cases, nothing else. The tools that had been promised were not there. The seed for planting was not there. The livestock were not there. The compensation for the property they had left behind, houses, farms, mills, stores, accumulated assets built over generations, was supposed to be calculated and paid. In most cases, it was delayed for years. Often, it was reduced to a fraction of the agreed amount. In some cases, it was never paid at all. A man who had owned a working farm in Georgia cleared land, built structures, established fields, was entitled under the treaty to compensation for what he left behind. What he received, if he received anything, bore no relationship to what he had lost. The house he built remained standing. Settlers moved into it. They paid nothing for it. The law had made their occupation of it completely legitimate. Legal. Not right, but legal. Think about the people on the other end of this. The soldiers who carried out the roundup, the contractors who managed the supply lines, the government agents who oversaw the camps. Most of them were not cruel men by the standards of their time. Some of them were genuinely troubled by what they were doing. A few resigned rather than participate. Most did their job because it was their job, because it was authorized by law, because the people giving the orders had authority, and the people receiving those orders rarely questioned authority when it came wrapped in official paper. That is how the largest injustices tend to happen, not through monsters doing monstrous things, through ordinary people doing their jobs inside a system that has decided something terrible is acceptable. A government agent sits in a tent at the edge of a holding camp in the summer of 1838. He is writing his weekly report to Washington. He records the number of people in the camp. He records the food distributed. He notes that the medical situation is deteriorating. He sends the report. He receives instructions to proceed with the planned timeline. He proceeds. He is not a villain in his own story. He is a man doing a job. He probably went home afterward and lived a long life and was regarded by his neighbors as a decent person. That is the uncomfortable truth at the center of this. By the time the last groups arrived in Indian Territory in the spring of 1839, the physical march was over, but the effects had only begun. Populations that had been stable and functioning for generations were fractured. Extended family networks had been broken apart by death and separation. Community leadership structures had been disrupted. The agricultural knowledge that was specific to the southeastern landscape, which plants to grow, when to plant them, how to manage the soil through wet seasons and dry ones, had to be relearned from scratch in a place that operated by completely different rules. The language had to survive. The stories had to survive. The ceremonies had to survive. All of it carried in memory because there was no longer a stable physical place to anchor them. That takes more than one generation to stabilize. And yet, stabilization happened. Within decades, the Five Nations had built functioning institutions in Indian Territory. They had legal systems. They had elected governments. They had schools that taught both native languages and English. The Cherokee Nation's legal code was sophisticated enough that legal scholars from the East studied it. And then it happened again. In the early decades of the 20th century, Indian Territory was systematically opened to non-native settlement. New laws dissolved the communal land holdings of the Five Nations and redistributed land as individual allotments, a policy that was framed as modernization and equality, but functioned to transfer massive amounts of land out of native ownership within a single generation. By the time Indian Territory was absorbed into the state of Oklahoma in 1907, the political sovereignty that had survived the removal, that had been rebuilt with extraordinary effort and determination, had been largely dismantled through a new set of legal mechanisms. Different paperwork, same outcome. There is one more detail about the physical march itself that tends to be smoothed over in the telling. The route taken by many Cherokee groups went through areas where local populations were openly hostile. Towns along the route charged inflated prices for basic supplies, food, blankets, firewood, knowing the marching groups had nowhere else to go and no ability to negotiate. Some refused service entirely. Tavern owners who would sell to any passing traveler refused to sell to the Cherokee. In some areas, local men would follow the column and offer to buy valuables from people who were desperate, jewelry, tools, anything with resale value, at a fraction of what it was worth. There was money to be made from the removal, not just in the contracts for supply and transport, also in the smaller transactions along the road, in the land sales back east, where properties that had belonged to Cherokee families for generations were auctioned off cheaply and quickly, sometimes before the families who owned them had even left. A Cherokee woman who kept a detailed diary during the march recorded passing through towns where people came out to watch the column move through. She wrote that some watched silently, some turned away, a few wept, most simply watched. The way people watch something they know is wrong, but have decided is not their problem to stop. That image, the watchers, stays with you. And here is a question worth asking yourself. If you had been standing on the side of that road in the winter of 1838, watching a column of thousands of people march past in the cold, what would you have done? Not what you would like to think you would have done. What would you actually have done, given the law, the culture, the pressure of the moment? Most people would have watched. Most people did. Here is the question that sits at the center of all of this. If a people can win in the highest court in the land and still lose everything, if a legal ruling can simply be ignored by the people with power, what does that say about the system? Not the romantic version of the Wild West with gunslingers and frontier justice. The official version, the one built on courts and constitutions and government authority. The answer is not comfortable, but it is the honest one. A legal system is only as reliable as the willingness of the powerful to follow it. When that willingness disappears, the paper means nothing. The Trail of Tears is taught in schools, when it is taught at all, as a dark chapter. Something that happened. Something the country acknowledges and moves past. A mistake, perhaps, of a rougher era. But the people who walked that road did not get to move past it. Their children did not. The effects ran forward through generations in ways that are still measurable today in health outcomes, in land ownership, in economic data, in the distance between what was promised and what was delivered. The chapter did not close. It just stopped being discussed in polite company. There is one final thing worth sitting with. The chapter did not close. It just stopped being discussed in polite company. There is a smaller story inside this larger one that almost never gets told. Some Cherokee and members of other nations managed to hide. They slipped into the mountains of western North Carolina and stayed. They avoided the soldiers by moving into terrain that was too rough and too remote to be effectively searched. A few hundred people, maybe more, simply refused to be found. They stayed. They waited. They outlasted the immediate campaign, and their descendants are still there today, the eastern band of Cherokee Indians, living in the same mountains their ancestors refused to leave. They did not walk the trail. They endured a different kind of survival, hidden, watching, waiting for the soldiers to give up. That took years, and it cost them too, isolation, poverty, the constant fear of discovery. But they held the land, not the original territory, not the farms and towns that had been taken, but the mountains, the steep, impossible mountains that nobody else wanted badly enough to fight for. There is something in that story that matters. The land that was hardest to take was the land that was kept. The removal didn't happen because of lawless men operating outside the system. It happened because of men at the center of it, elected representatives who voted for the law, a president who signed it and enforced it selectively, generals who organized the military operation, judges who validated the legal framework, contractors who took the supply contracts, newspaper editors who wrote editorials in favor of the policy. These were all men working within the system, following procedures, collecting salaries, going home at night to their families. The whole machinery of a functioning democratic government moved in one direction and produced this result. A villain is easy to deal with. You condemn the villain and tell yourself you would have been different. A system is harder. A system requires you to ask not just what happened then, but what similar processes look like now, what ordinary compliance enables, what legal framing permits. Most people would rather not go there. But here you are, still listening, which means something. In the end, a family arrives at the edge of Indian Territory in the early spring of 1839. They have walked more than 1,000 miles. They have buried members of their family along the road. They have watched the winter take people who should have survived it. They arrive at land that belongs to no world they know, with less than they carried when they left, in a place that has never heard their name. The father kneels down and picks up a handful of the strange soil. He holds it. He lets it fall through his fingers. It is not the same. It does not smell like home. It does not feel like home. Nothing here does. But there is his family around him, his wife, his remaining children. They are alive. They are standing on ground that is now, by some legal designation, theirs. They begin, because what else do you do? They plant what they have. They build what they can. They keep the language alive by speaking it every day, by refusing to let it become something only the old people use. They keep the stories. They tell their children what the mountains looked like in the early morning, what the rivers smelled like in spring, what the names of the places they came from meant, and why those names mattered. Some of those children will never see any of it. They will know only the new land, the rebuilt towns, the reconstituted community. But they will know the names. That is what survives when everything else is taken. The names, the memory, the refusal to let the story end where someone else decided it should end. The trail had tears. It also had people who kept walking. And they are still here.